when you're dealing with a religion that tells you that there's a specific way that you need to do this, and then turns around and tells you that you have to maintain a childlike thought pattern with everything, there's real conflict that emerges out of that. It's another sign of a childish adult, where you never get out of this mode of playing the bully.
They don't realize how childish they sound or look because they're right. They're taught they're right, and they're taught that how they think is right, how they feel is right, and how they act is right.
And I'm very, very thankful that I never lost the ability to think rationally, that I always questioned, that it was always in my head that, sure, you may think that you're right, but what if someone were to prove to you that you were wrong? There's power in being right. And when I say being right, I mean being right in your own head.
Welcome to Unbound,
a podcast for new atheists
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals,
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle. And it's time to get unbound.
But Jesus said, "Suffer little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Oh, you'll suffer, all right. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle.
And this week we're finally getting to that one topic that I have teased so many times before, the topic of childlike faith. Oh yeah, you'll suffer, all right. Identity crises, interpersonal problems with other people, mental illness brought on by evangelical doctrine that you choose to follow into adulthood. It's all there, and we're going to talk about it all tonight. The reference for that verse that I just gave you is Matthew 19:14, where Jesus tells his disciples to let the little children come to him and says that this is what the kingdom is like. Well, that certainly does coincide with the story in the garden, doesn't it? It really does.
Yeah.
It has everything to do with the fact that this religion wants you to stay immature, wants you to stay dependent on daddy for as long as you live. We did an entire episode on the fall of mankind, so I'm not going to get too far into that. You can always go back and listen to our fundamental flaws episode that deals with that. I believe it's one of the earlier ones, probably episode 3 or 4, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Something like
it's
that.
Way back there. But we did an entire episode on what was really going on in the Garden of Eden, so I'm going to leave that there. But it plays heavily on what we're talking about tonight, so you'll probably want to go back and listen to it when you're done. Here's the problem. 1 Corinthians 13:11. Paul tells us, "When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." That's kind of a contradiction from what we're told we're supposed to aspire to when it comes to having childlike faith. Evangelicals like to say that there is a difference between childish and childlike faith, and technically they're right. I think the lines are very blurred, but technically they're right from the perspective of literal definition. The common interpretation among evangelicals blurs the lines between the two even more. Childish, and I just did a quick Google search and asked for definitions for these. Childish came up with of, like, or appropriate to a child, silly and immature. That's childish. Childlike means having good qualities associated with a child. I think the good there is very, very significant. And I think that is where the lines start getting blurred between what is childlike and what is childish in the way that evangelicals interpret this. So the good qualities reflect childlikeness. Poor qualities reflect childishness. So we're going to talk about the differences between the two and how they pan out when we're talking about evangelical faith. What childlike faith is supposed to be looks something like this. Honesty in thought and intention. This encompasses things like accepting the idea that people need Jesus, or that the individual needs Jesus. Open-minded thinking. Acceptance that you don't know everything, and not having enough ego involved to be embarrassed about it. You go to church to learn, become a better person, and a better Christian. Trust to the point of vulnerability. Giving your life to Christ is a big part of this, and having faith in your own salvation, believing that you've been saved. And then there's the necessity and trust in parents, or in this case, God, which goes directly back to Genesis 3 and why you shouldn't aspire to becoming an adult. Here's how it actually manifests. Normally, it manifests with first a lack of apologetic or real conviction. Most Christians will say anything and backpedal on everything in their attempt to be right. Second, they're extremely closed-minded and impervious to outside opinions. They have a craven fear of things that shouldn't incite fear in Christians, things like death or opposing views or healthy debate. What about 1 Peter 3:15? It says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready to always give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." How many evangelicals do you know who have a well mapped out, unwavering apologetic? I mean, I've met some, but I think that has a lot more to do with the circles that I moved in at the time. They are definitely an extreme minority, and many follow a specific formula that they were taught, that they didn't actually discover. They were taught. As far as the death thing, well, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago too. Most Christians have a fear of death, even though they're supposed to have this blessed hope in what comes after.
Yeah.
Most of them are deathly afraid. Well, there's a
Yeah.
there's a descriptor for you. Most of them are very afraid.
Yes.
Of dying, because at the end of the day, they know that they don't know. And
Right.
that's really what it boils down to. They have no proof for what they believe. Their beliefs give them comfort, but that rational mind is still in there. That little beacon in the back of their head is telling them there's something that's off about this.
Right.
So most of them definitely do fear dying.
Yeah. Oh, and also, the fear of death is also fear of judgment, because, that is what you have to look forward to. You have to look forward to judgment for everything you've done.
Right.
And nobody is so good that they would feel confident in the face of that.
Well, even Billy Graham,
Yeah.
who, like him or hate him, I'm definitely somewhere in between. I know that I liked him when I was mired in the Kool-Aid, and when I was going to Word of Life every summer, I liked him. But even Billy Graham, he was kind of a fence rider on this one.
Yeah.
He was once asked, what is it that that you want? I think the way that the conversation went was that he was asked what he wanted God to tell him when he was standing at the pearly gates, and he said, "I want to hear, 'Well done, thou good and faithful servant,' but I don't think I will." So you can look at that as humility, or you can look at it as self-doubt. You can look at it from a number of different perspectives, but I do believe that it says a lot about where your average Christian is. If someone like Billy Graham can look at his own situation, and someone who spent his entire life, quote unquote, serving the Lord, and that's the way that he views what his afterlife is going to look like, it says a lot about what the average Christian likely thinks about their afterlife and their chances of it being good. So, yeah, there's definitely that fear of death. The last part of that whole manifestation thing, godly behavior is really an afterthought with most Christians. Personal comfort rules and narcissistic tendencies emerge when you tell people that they need to proceed from a childlike mindset. If you tell them to stay in that mindset, this is the type of thing that it manifests. By definition, these things are in fact childish and not childlike, but they fall much more in lockstep with the way most evangelicals live their lives and the personas that they exhibit to the rest of the world. It's not childlike. It's incredibly childish. And for the reasons that I just cited, and we've got a lot more to talk about tonight on that particular subject and issue, the Bible teaches us first that we should stay children forever. And I'm going again back to Genesis 3, the story of the fall of mankind. I still maintain that this is the story of people growing up, and it being a cautionary tale about how growing up is a bad idea. But then Paul tells us different. He teaches us differently, doesn't he? In 1 Corinthians 13:11, he tells us that there comes a point where you have to put away childish things. So which is it?
Yes.
Which is it? There are so many conflicting things going on in this particular arena that it's difficult to really figure out what we're supposed to be doing as adults in this religion. The lines get blurred even further when you bring in popular media like Christian music. We were talking about that song by Twyla Paris.
Oh, yeah.
The warrior is a child.
Yes.
There's all kinds of childlikeness imagery in Christian music. There's a lot in the hymns. There's a lot in contemporary Christian music. It's a running theme. And I think that people blur those lines in their own head too. Because when you think about things that are childlike, you think about innocence, and you think about simplicity of thought, and you think about how much simpler your life was before you had to get up and adult every day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So on the surface, these things sound very positive. Rest in the Lord. Put all of your cares on him, for he cares for you. We're told that we can sleep in the shelter of his wing. There's so many things just in the Psalms that perpetuate this child and father kind of thing that it becomes difficult to figure out when you're supposed to get around to being an adult. So here are some other ways that it manifests, not just on the surface, but ways that I've seen. People insisting on getting their own way. We talked during the episode on Mission Impossible about how I was supposed to take over that Sunday school class, but the person who was already teaching the Sunday school class went and cried to a board member who then dragged me into a meeting and basically said, I don't care who this guy is. She wants to teach the class. She's going to teach it. So she basically pouted and temper tantrumed her way into continuing to teach that class. So there was that. When I was interning, no less than 3 times this happened, where people sent letters to the pastor that I had to sit there and listen to and cringe as I was listening to. So he brought in the entire pastoral staff, and I was considered part of that for that summer. So the 4 of us sat there in that room, and we listened. 3 of us listened while he read. And some of the things that people chose to complain about in terms of the way the church did things, the way a service was run, the way ideas were presented from the pulpit, these are the types of things that people would write letters about. And even better, there was one in particular that came along with a demand that this letter be read from the pulpit, that it was an open letter to everybody in the church, including the pastor, and that this person, as a member of the church, expected that it would simply be read from the pulpit because he said to.
Wow.
Because membership has its privileges. Now, I'm sorry, they bring that on themselves. They definitely bring that part of it on themselves, because the moment you initiate people as members of the church, all of a sudden there's an attitude of importance that comes along with that, and it manifests in things like that letter. Let's talk about people who get offended by everything and expect everyone around them to bend to make them more comfortable.
Right.
Or just walk up and down the halls at Valley Forge Christian College literally for days on end talking about how this one thing offends you. That happened. I remember listening to somebody rant about something that one of the senior speakers had to say from the pulpit, and went off on it for days. And I mean, if you were within 10 feet of this guy, you could hear him ranting about it. It was all he thought about and talked about for like days running.
Oy.
And I get the impression that somebody finally just got fed up with it and went to the Dean of Men, and he got a talking to about the volume of his protestations here.
Yeah.
But I can remember it like it was yesterday. And the crazy thing is, I was at that chapel service, and I remember thinking that what this guy said was a little bit off too.
Right.
But I wasn't about to let it ruin my day. It's like, oh, okay, well, you know what? You believe that? Great. Hopefully you find a church that agrees with you. Yeah. But I won't be going there. So, and for me, that was where it ended. It's like, okay, this opinion is a little out there, but I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm not going to let it ruin my day. I'm just going to look at it as this is the way that you don't think about this, and this is the way that you don't run your ministry, because that's what it was about. It was commentary about how an effective pastoral ministry should be run, and there were some kind of wigged out ideas.
Yeah.
Not quite as wigged out as the absolute power guy that came in
geez.
during
Swinging
whatever
the
that
chair.
was. Yeah.
Yeah.
the guy that came in and swung the chair around, among other things.
Oh, boy.
It wasn't quite that bad, but it was definitely in the neighborhood. And I think that if this guy was going to be honest, he would tell you that this speaker was where he got a lot of this from. He gleaned just a little bit too much from that talk. But there were a lot of people that were offended by Mr. Absolute Power, including the president of the school.
Yeah.
But it was joked about. It was kind of laughed off. And we were told not to take it too seriously.
Right.
We were told not to take it too seriously while the guy was still in the room. It was subtle. But I remember the president of the school getting up at the end of one of these meetings and saying words to the effect of, different people have different perspectives on certain things.
Right.
And that was supposed to kind of smooth it over. And then later on, I want to say that it was either at baccalaureate or at commencement that year, where he mentioned it from the pulpit and got a bunch of laughs. Yeah. So, most people who were there that day knew not to take it that seriously. Right. And we were told by people who were in quote unquote authority that we shouldn't take it that seriously. But this guy, during his senior sermon, really touched on a lot of the same things. And it raised certain people's hackles. And this one person in particular who just, thank goodness he didn't live in my dorm. I'd be hearing it literally day and night. He was not in my dorm, but as soon as you walked out of your dorm, if he was within earshot, you heard it.
Oh, boy.
So, yeah. I mean, how many examples do you need? I mean, and if you've been in this religion for more than 5 minutes, you know precisely what I'm talking about with people being offended by everything.
Right.
And what it boils down to is don't fuck with my personal comfort. Don't fuck with my opinions on anything. You're not allowed to have an opinion that's different from mine because mine is the only one that matters. So that's where that kind of thinking comes from. And that's when you start feeling offended by everything. When you start feeling threatened by your own lack of apologetic.
Right.
And you latch on to something, all of a sudden it's this way or no way. And that's very, very problematic. It's also very, very child-ish.
Right.
People who leave churches for petty reasons. Steve Taylor again, blame your failures on churches where you've gone. It's the steeplechase.
Yes.
Yep. So, I mean, and again, it goes back to the whole letters thing. Mm-hmm. One of those letters that summer was from a family that left the church, and it was literally like a 4 or 5 page tirade. We were sitting there for a while, listening to everything that we're doing wrong at Faith Assembly. And, I'm sitting there and I'm trying so hard to maintain a straight face because I figure, the other people in the room are taking this seriously. And I'm literally sitting there thinking to myself, do you not realize that we're better off not having them here and spreading this idiocy to the rest of the congregation? That was another one that they expected the letter to be read from the pulpit. It's like, you're not even here anymore. You don't get to drop this bomb and run away. If you want it read, then stand there out in the lobby after church. And instead of shaking the pastor's hand, they can come up to you and tell you what they thought of your letter.
Yeah.
But no, you're already gone. No, there's no way that this is going to get read from the pulpit. But it was, I'd seen that in youth group too. There was one girl in particular during my internship who decided that she was done with youth group. And she wrote a very, very long-winded letter to our youth pastor that she wanted read during the next youth group meeting. It's like, we're not going to start our youth group meeting on a downer.
Right.
Okay?
Seriously.
And everyone was aware of what the situation was. And this was someone who had struggled with her own identity quite a bit, had struggled making friends in the youth group. And for good or for bad, we were still kids. And I did my best to try and make everyone who decided to come to youth group feel at least comfortable being there. But this was not someone that I would have considered a friend or really wanted to hang out with either. So her own social anxieties and her own brand of social awkwardness kind of culminated in not a whole lot of people liking her, wanting to hang out with her.
Yeah. And
she wrote a long-winded letter that she wanted read. And, of course, it never got read at youth group. We did reach out to her, and it didn't really end well. Yeah. She kind of returned with a fuck you.
Well, youth groups are not the best place for anyone who really has a social anxiety.
Right, yeah.
Especially when you're teenagers. Everybody's in their own little world anyway.
Yeah.
You know, you don't really realize what other people are going through because you're going through so much crap your own self.
Yep.
These things they slip, and unless you're really aware of every single person that comes to your youth group, they're going to slip through the cracks because...
Some of them do, especially in a bigger youth group. Now,
Right.
I wouldn't have considered Faith Assembly a huge youth group, but it was bigger than average. When I first started going, there were probably 25 or 30. It
Right.
got grown to the point where there were like 60 people in that youth group.
Right. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot, but it's still not a huge group. And this person was invited to start coming to youth group by a well-established family in the church. So she kind of had built-in friends to begin with. It's just
Right.
that no one else really paid her a whole lot of attention.
Right.
And when no one else really paid her a lot of attention, she just decided that we were all full of shit and that she was done.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, she wasn't exactly wrong, but her reasons for thinking that were definitely off, because there were a number of us that reached out to her and tried to make her a little bit more comfortable. And it was a losing battle, because she wanted things that I don't think she was going to find there. Mm-hmm. And I also think that there were at least a couple of guys that she liked that failed to give her the time of day.
Yeah.
So that was another problem right there. So she was scorned, she was angry, and she left in a fit. And that was that. Now, you know, we're talking about childish versus childlike and how it affects adults. So, you know, the youth group end of it, it's difficult to place a whole lot of judgment, because
Right.
like we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, there are so many mixed signals
Right.
that people that age are given by this religion that it's difficult for anyone to even expect that they're going to deal with things on a mature or adult level. So I don't really fault this particular person for the way that she handled it. But what was the excuse of the grown man and his wife who both penned that letter together about why they and their family were leaving the church and insisted that the letter be read,
Right.
quote unquote, if you're man enough to read this from the pulpit,
Wow.
unquote. Yeah. This last one on this particular list, I will go on record saying that I have been guilty of this. You've heard of prayer warriors? What about prayer whiners? People who complain about things in their own life when they're praying out loud in corporate prayer settings, okay? I've done this. I will go directly on record and say that this is something that I have done. I have prayed out loud for the express purpose of garnering sympathy. And I've seen it in a number of different venues and in a number of different ways. The one that sticks out in my head was the one and only Tres Dias weekend that I actually went on, where there was one guy who, during one of our corporate prayer gatherings during the weekend, starts praying about how everybody else is talking about how they're feeling a certain way and experiencing this and experiencing that. Well, Lord, I haven't felt anything yet. You're not talking to God. You're talking to everybody else in the room. You're telling us to make this a better experience for you. Don't bring God into it.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was the same thing when I did it. It wasn't about me wanting something from God. It was about me wanting pity from the people who were in the room.
Right.
So, again, very childish, not a childlike trait. Remember, childlike has to do with the positives.
Right.
Okay? Just the very basic definition of childlike is that these are the positive attributes of a child. Now, these things can manifest in a positive way, but they usually don't. In the course of researching this, I came across a really good article from Psychology Today, and I want to pull it back up because I want to get you the author and everything. This is an article called "Can You Spot 10 Signs of a Childish Adult?" by Susan Heitler, PhD. Okay, there's a date on here, March 4th, 2016. This hit psychologytoday.com. Susan Heitler, PhD, can you spot 10 signs of a childish adult? So again, I'm going to let everybody know that my commentary here is what I gleaned from the article in the context of the things that we're talking about. So she does not approach this from an evangelical angle at all. I just went through this list and started brainstorming. okay, how does this relate? What have I experienced? What do I know about this? That validates this in an evangelical setting. So the article has nothing to do with evangelical faith. It has to do with just basic human and adult psychology. So it's definitely worth a read, but I think that anyone who has been part of this religion is going to look at this and say, there have been plenty of people in my church who have behaved like this, who have displayed these qualities, or if you want to be real honest, I've displayed some of these qualities. I have no problem with admitting that I have been guilty of some of these, and I'll give some details as we go. Here are some of the things that she goes over in this article. Emotional escalations. Young children often cry, get mad, or outwardly appear petulant and pouting. Grown-ups seldom do. I think that you're seeing a lot more petulance with the whole COVID thing. You're seeing a lot more of it.
Oh, yeah.
You're starting to see what some people's true colors are. But still, the ones that bitch and complain about having to wear a mask in a store are still in a very, very small minority. They have a loud voice, but they're a very small minority. So I guess I can get behind this to the point where I know that it's just a few, but the louder that voice is, the bigger it looks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, grown-ups seldom do display these qualities, but in evangelical terms, the emotional escalation aspect of this manifests in a number of ways and situations, many of which have to do with differences of opinions on spiritual issues, or when they get called out for their behavior on the basis of biblical teachings, principles, that sort of thing. They get called out and they go into full defense mode. Many of my own anger issues grew out of things like this. It can also manifest where there are interpersonal issues, just like with those letters, you know what I mean? I would consider a letter like that challenges a pastor to read something from the pulpit if he's man enough to be an emotional escalation. It can also manifest where there are interpersonal issues and pastors and church leaders refuse to step in. In other words, they refuse to become the parent in that situation. Yes, there are some responsible pastors out there who insist on biblical solutions to these kinds of problems. Many Christians want someone else to deal with their problems, and this is not their fault. As far as I'm concerned, this is a matter of conditioning. They are taught this the instant they're told they can leave their poor choices and defects of character at the foot of the cross. People who look to externals to solve or mitigate their problems have a hard time with approaching someone with a personal complaint, accusation, or grievance, and they have a very hard time just dealing with these things themselves. They flat out don't know how to deal with it because of the contradictory messaging that they get in other areas of life from their religion. A lot of times, it's not even a matter of, well, did you invoke the Pauline principle here and go talk to them first? Most people aren't capable of doing that regardless of what their religion is.
Right.
Most people don't have the capacity to simply approach the source of the problem. They're going to go to someone who they consider to be an authority who can rectify the problem. That's a people thing. But when you're dealing with a religion that tells you that there's a specific way that you need to do this, and then turns around and tells you that you have to maintain a childlike thought pattern with everything, there's real conflict that emerges out of that. On the one hand, I'm supposed to be mature and I'm supposed to handle it myself. On the other hand, I'm supposed to be giving all of this stuff to God.
Right.
I'm supposed to be praying for that person. I'm supposed to be doing all kinds of things that don't involve interacting with them directly or personally. So most people's solution to this is going to be to go to their pastor.
Right.
And complain to their pastor. Some pastors will tell them, okay, well, you need to figure out how to deal with this on your own and talk to that person. But most are going to step in and intervene because it helps them feel a little bit more useful. And they also don't want conflicts within their ranks, within their organization. They don't want people fighting in their church. They don't want that kind of infighting. So rather than teach these people to deal with things on a mature level, they assume the role of the parent.
Right.
And go after that other person, get their side, maybe bring the two in together to talk so that they can hash it out in front of somebody who they consider to be quote-unquote an authority. But here's the problem. That's not what the Bible says to do, is it?
No.
But the Bible says a whole hell of a lot more about how you're supposed to stay a child than it does about how to act like an adult. So it makes perfect sense to me that these people would go to their pastor looking for a solution before they would just approach another person. Now, I've had people do this with me, and I've responded to it in varying degrees. Well, okay, let's be real, in varying degrees of bad. And, you know, when you try it a couple of times and people don't respond in a mature manner, then it becomes less comfortable to even think about, much less do.
Right.
So there are some people who do attempt to do things the right way, but when that fails them a couple of times, it's not a priority anymore. And they figure, well, this hasn't worked in the past, so let's just go for the jugular and get the pastor involved, or get the boss involved, or get whoever the adult authority is in that situation involved. It goes beyond the walls of the church.
Right.
It does. But in this context, we're talking about how people conduct themselves as a matter of faith. So as a matter of faith, they're supposed to go to the person.
Right.
But they don't. They go to their pastor, and more times than not, the pastor is going to deal with it, him or herself, because the pastor does not want conflict within the walls of the church.
Right.
Blaming. Blaming is the next one on her list. When things go wrong, young children look to blame someone. Grown-ups, mature grown-ups, look to fix the problem. That's the thought by the author. Here's my thought on that as it relates to what we're talking about. Evangelicals often dismiss their own bad behavior by crying things like demonic oppression.
Yes.
Or by defending their personal character while playing the victim. Or they insist that the real problem has to do with things that other people do or say. They take it off of themselves and put it on someone else. Why? Because that's what they've been taught to do with everything. Lay all of your sins at the foot of the cross. Let something external deal with your defects of character. Don't bother trying to fix yourself.
Right.
Pastors are often the targets for this kind of behavior, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago. Well, if you would just do something about whatever it is, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Well, if you would just tell them to, if you would just get them off my back about, it's true that it takes two to tango. So
Yes.
if somebody has an issue with someone else, it's never just the other person. But the way that evangelicals are taught to think about situations like this puts them in a position where it's easier to just take the blame off themselves and put it someplace else, because we've taught them to do that from the moment they got saved.
Right.
And that's a problem. Lies. Oh, here's a good one. Here's a good
Yeah.
one. When there's a situation that's uncomfortable, young children might lie to stay out of trouble. Might. They usually do. And here's another one that maybe not. This is the author of the article. She says, grown-ups deal with reality, reliably speaking the truth. Oh, I know plenty of adults that have lied to get their asses out of a sling, too.
Well, yeah.
It happens. But it happens when you're an adult over things that are a little bit more serious. You know, the real surfacey stuff, we don't have a tendency to lie about.
Right.
Whereas children, they just want to stay out of trouble. And I mean, you can catch a child with his hand in the cookie jar. And what was the old joke about that? You walk into the room and there's the kid with the hand in the cookie jar. What are you doing? I was getting a cookie for you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was getting a cookie for you. You know what? I've used that one. I've used that one. Like
Yeah.
I've said before, people are very much alike. We're pretty predictable. So the first time I heard that joke, it's like, oh yeah, I've been there. As a kid, I've been there. And you know, I wish, show of hands, if I could see my listeners, show of, I'll bet there'd be a few hands that went up over that one. Whether it was a cookie or something else that you didn't want the adult to get angry about. It's like, well, I was doing this for you. And I can think, you know, off the top of my head, there are a couple of other minor examples, but real kiddish kind of
Yeah.
examples of that same sort of thing. So while hardly isolated to evangelicals, this kind of behavior manifests in a number of ways in evangelical adults. It usually has less to do with staying out of trouble as it does with saving face. They lie to protect their reputations or to protect their spiritual persona. They lie about things that are easy to trace back to them. I mean, it never ceased to amaze me, some of the things that people would lie about, and the truth was literally like sitting right there in front of you. They provide wildly different accounts of interpersonal interactions than other involved parties or onlookers. They claim, I never said that, even if the accuser has emails or texts where they did. They lie unabashedly and actually believe themselves while wondering why others don't like them or trust them. You know, you tell enough lies and you start believing every word that comes out of your own mouth. You believe that your lies are true. That's not just evangelicals, that's people in general. If you are a pathological liar, there comes a point where you have a hard time distinguishing between what the truth is and what a lie is. Well, how does evangelical Christianity help with that? It really doesn't, because you're told all of these things about who God is and how he interacts with humanity. And then when these things fail to happen, you don't want to think about them as lies. You don't want to think about them as untruths. So these things start getting all mishmashed inside your head. What is truth? What is a lie? I'm told that God is this, but he's proving to be this, or he's proving to be nothing. And I'm told that I should believe in this and that this is going to happen, and then it never happens. So these things escalate inside your head.
Right.
Lies and truth start getting very, very, very mixed up in the way that this religion teaches you to think. Goes right back to our discussion on mental illness. All the different messages that go on in your head can definitely manifest as different personality disorders, including schizophrenia, which it's very scary, but it can. And we did a whole episode on that, so I'm going to leave that there. Name calling. Next one's name calling.
Oh, boy.
Children call each other names. Adults seek to understand issues. I don't know if this person has spent much time on social media, but let me tell you, you get into a discussion with somebody about something and you get the high ground in the argument, it very quickly degenerates into name calling or personal attacks. The thing that I get the most when I'm debating someone on social media, I will get sworn at and called rude names, or someone will start taking pot shots at my looks.
Yeah.
That's basically the way that it goes. So, yeah, I'm sorry, but adults do this too. And honestly, it's scary how much of this you actually see, especially on social media, which is why I kind of wish I didn't need Facebook. And there are people out there that I would completely lose track of without it.
Right. Same.
But it's really a double-edged sword. If I didn't feel the need to use it, I would not be on social media right now. It boils my blood a whole lot more than it makes me happy.
Yeah.
But it's also an anchor to certain people that you just wouldn't have that connection with without.
That's the biggest problem with Facebook.
Right. The next thing she says here is adults do not make ad hominem attacks, that is, attacks on people's personal traits. Instead, they attack the problem. They do not disrespect others with mean labels. Again, you don't spend a whole lot of time on social media because there are plenty of people that will do this. I think that to validate that statement, you would have to put it in a face-to-face personal context because most people are way different in real life than they are on social media. Yeah. But there's a decent amount to disagree with there. But again, with evangelicals, this manifests in very specific ways, like accusing people of being under demonic influence.
Yes.
And calling out individual sins or sinful attitudes or behaviors in others. Calling a 14-year-old girl a hussy for going to multiple proms is a prime example of this. Yes. Calling someone a backslider or a whore or just classifying them as a bad Christian also apply here. And I heard a lot of all of that.
Oh, yeah.
A lot. It started in youth group, but a lot of times it was initiated by an adult, just like that youth pastor. Oh, yeah. This girl goes to too many proms. She must be a hussy. Come on now. Impulsivity is the next one. Or as therapists say, poor impulse control. Children strike out impulsively when they feel hurt or mad. Well, so do a lot of evangelicals. It manifests with angry words and accusations that have no basis in reality or interpersonal misunderstandings. They take issue with things people say or do and can sometimes act out publicly. Sometimes they write letters Sometimes they stand up in the middle of church services. I've seen that happen too.
Yeah.
Where someone didn't like something that was said from the pulpit and got up and yelled something at the pastor and walked out.
Wow.
I mean, I was close a couple of times. The last few times that we deigned to accompany my mother and family to Faith Assembly, there were a few things that were said from that pulpit that I wanted to jump up on my feet and say, you know what, you're full of shit.
Yeah.
But at that point, I wasn't thinking like a Pentecostal evangelical anymore, and I had to remind myself of that. And it's like, there's a time and a place.
Yeah.
But this guy, he was bashing another church that was in our area, and it was a Catholic church. And, you know, there's something about evangelicals that and Catholics, they're like oil and water. They don't mix at all. So never having attended this church, never having any real interaction with anyone who went to that church, because he didn't like something that the priest of that church had to say during a debate, all of a sudden he has to not only vilify the church from the pulpit, but he has to say the name of the church over and over and over again, and this idiot never got it right.
I think I remember that.
Never got the name of the church right, and I knew what church he was talking about. And it was all I could do to not jump to my feet and say, hey, idiot, it's called this, not this.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to bash the place, can you at least get the name right?
Yeah.
Seriously.
I think I remember that. I'm not sure what the big hubbub was about, but yeah, I remember them doing that. And it's like, okay, what does this have to do with our walk with Jesus?
This was back during my preterist days.
Oh, yes.
And this guy was more of a universalist.
Yeah.
Than he was, you know, a typical Catholic in the way that he thought.
Right.
So he took a more universalist view on certain things, and it really raised the hackles of the pastor at this church.
It's like, dude, you guys are like oil and water. You're never going to agree on stuff.
Right.
Just leave it alone because it's none of your business.
No, it really isn't, because it's but it goes right back to what I was talking about last week, where they don't want you mixing and mingling. They want you getting all of your indoctrination from one place, so that there isn't a lot of crosstalk.
Yeah.
So he made sure that he vilified this place to the nth degree. Only one problem: he couldn't fucking remember the name, and kept saying it wrong over and over and over again. So it's like, okay, well, you know what? Mission accomplished. No one's going to go to this church because it doesn't fucking exist.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, but they may actually go to this one that actually does exist. And you know what? After hearing about what this priest had to say during that debate, I was actually interested.
Yeah,
I wanted to hear what a homily sounded like from this guy.
Yeah.
And with the kinds of things that he was teaching his congregation, because I'll tell you what, those people probably walked out of there with a little bit more of a healthy mindset than anyone who has ever walked out of Faith Assembly. I'm sorry. Sue me if you want. But, you know, the proof is in the pudding here. Show me what you were doing for people that actually has a positive influence on them and a positive outcome in their life. What about what you're doing makes their life better? And go. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, I'm going to get off of that subject because I really don't want to get sued. So let's see. Where were we here? Oh, impulsivity, or as therapists say, poor impulse control. Pentecostal churches where manifestations of the Holy Spirit happen unchecked are also breeding grounds for impulsive behaviors. Speaking out with a word of knowledge is often an impulse move and can empower the speaker to become even more impulsive over time. Providing their own interpretations of their own messages is usually how it escalates, because now they want their own ideas to be out there. And this gives them, the way that most Pentecostal churches are structured, gives them a platform for delivering their own opinions on anything. And it is all too often accepted as a direct message from God and never challenged. Even when the majority of people present, including the pastor, know they're full of shit.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, there was this one woman, and you know who it is because you've been to my church.
Old Faithful.
Old Faithful. And that's exactly what she said. It's like, here's Old Faithful again. And it's like everybody knew, and it was always the same. It was always the same message in tongues. It was always the same interpretation. She gave both, and it was her little time.
Yep.
It was her 5 seconds of fame or whatever.
Yeah, she was getting her 15 minutes, 10 seconds per church service at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. And do you remember, I forget who the student was, not that I would name him on the show anyway, but do you remember when we were at Valley Forge, the guy talking about the lady who got up in church one Sunday and started touting all this stuff, like, and speaking as God to the congregation, saying things like, I will swoop down on you, like the Japs swoop down on you.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I remember that guy talking.
The whole Pearl Harbor thing. She's relating Pearl Harbor to what God's going to do to this church if they don't straighten up.
Oh my gosh,
And
it's just...
literally started as part of her interpretation of this message in tongues. She's making machine gun noises and gunning down the congregation. Why didn't we talk about this when we were talking about mental illness? But
I know, right? Well, I forgot all about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we were at your dorm. We were out in the front of the dorm, whatever they called it, where the guys could go.
Yeah.
And I sort of
co-ed lounge.
Yeah, the co-ed lounge. And I heard part of this conversation going on, and I sort of inserted into it a little bit. I said, "You can't be serious about this." He's like, "Oh no, she did this, and she did it more than once. She brought in machine guns. She brought in tanks. She just threatened the entire congregation with mass destruction if we didn't shape up."
Wow.
And it was supposed to be, a direct word from God. And I remember asking him, "Well, does your pastor didn't say anything about this? Didn't do anything about it?" It's like, we all know what she's like. So
Yeah.
It's like, what was he saying there? We know that there are crazy people in our church, so sue us.
Yeah.
And that was it. I mean, people were more entertained by it than they were appalled by it. Hopefully she doesn't do this on Bring a Friend Day.
Oh, boy.
But at the same time, if this is just... we talked about how churches normalize mental illness, how they create a home for it. And this is just another example of that. Mm-hmm. Someone getting up in the middle of church and giving a word in tongues and then their own interpretation. That's something like that.
Yeah.
Equating what God's going to do to this church to what the Japanese, not the Japs, the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
So my brain is addled thinking about this. It's just one of those things that when my brain goes back to it, it just doesn't even want to try to process it.
Yeah, it's crazy.
The fact that it happened and the fact that it was allowed to go on because, well, everyone knows what she's like.
And it's just sort of like, well, she should still know that it's not good to give in to that impulse. It's like, this is, yeah.
No, it's true, but I can almost guarantee that the pastor of this church probably at one point or another got enough complaints about it that he did sit her down and she agreed to X, Y, and Z. And then the moment the Spirit moved her again, it all just went right out the window. Yeah. So after a couple of rounds of that, you've got a couple of decisions to make. Either you put that person out of your church, or you just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, everybody knows what she's like.
Yeah.
And that was the direction that they chose to go with that particular situation. This kind of rampant spiritual expression is warned against by Paul. But too many pastors just ignore it in favor of letting the Spirit flow. Does it matter if the alleged Spirit is flooding your church with heresy?
It should, but...
That's the question. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14:4, he who speaks in tongues edifies himself.
Right.
So that really is the point with a lot of these people who spew out in tongues all the time. They're edifying themselves, and they're drawing attention to themselves. And this is another avenue toward narcissism.
Right.
Instilled narcissism. Maybe the person walking through the doors of that church the first day doesn't have this kind of personality disorder, but the way that they're taught to think starts bringing it out over time. I think that a lot of personality disorders are definitely innate, that they're there when you're young, when you're born. But your environment has a lot to do with how they grow. It's just like growing anything. So being in that kind of an environment and being given that kind of a platform, it's fertile ground for those kinds of thoughts to start growing and manifesting. Paul also said in 1 Corinthians 14, 26 and 27, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or 3 at most, each in turn, and let one interpret. Now, you and I have both seen services that were complete and total free-for-alls when it came to people speaking in tongues. So this advice, a lot of times, goes right out the window.
Oh, yeah.
Right out the window, because the pastor of that church is more interested in seeing, quote-unquote, the Spirit flow. Well, didn't Paul just say that that's not how the Spirit flows, that, God is a God of order and he wants it to be done this way?
Right.
But there are plenty of pastors out there that feel like they're stifling what the Spirit wants to do by trying to have too much control. So one of the things that I liked about the last church that we went to in New York was that they had certain rules of conduct.
Yeah.
They didn't allow certain things to escalate or get out of hand. They didn't allow one person to shine a spotlight on themselves. So for good or for bad, certain things happened after we left that church that confirmed for me a few things that I started thinking about the pastor of that church before we left. I liked him, but there were certain canaries in the coal mine that wound up being true.
Right.
But to his credit, he understood what his role was as a pastor, and he understood what, quote-unquote, healthy worship, if there's such a thing in Pentecostal settings, looked like. This church was one of the closest things to that I think you could get, because he insisted on doing things Paul's way. Right. And, I mean, people gave messages in tongues in that church, and people gave interpretations. But it was different. It was different than things that I saw happen at Faith Assembly, where, people would just start spewing off in tongues, and before you knew it, half the congregation was spewing off in tongues.
Yeah.
Now, the Bible's pretty clear about how ineffective that is. There was, I actually have it right here. 1 Corinthians 14, 18, and 19 this time. I thank my God that I speak with tongues more than all of you, yet in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that I may teach others also, than 10,000 words in a tongue. And you know what? I always thought of that. I always thought, whenever everyone started spewing off in tongues at the same time, I always thought about that. It's like, we need to have some semblance of order here. And I likened it to my grade school cafeteria and the din of all the children talking at once. What are we talking about tonight? Yeah. Well, that's pretty much what it sounds like, a bunch of babbling toddlers, or really infants, because toddlers can make words.
Yeah.
We have got a lot of motorcycles going by tonight. I don't know if you guys can hear it. I'm hearing it in my headset. But there's a lot of motorcycles going by our house tonight.
Oh, yeah.
So apologies in advance. We are still just sitting here in our dining room and doing this thing of ours. So you hear things. You hear the dog walk by. You hear the cats. And now you're going to hear motorcycles. Yeah. Bonus. So getting back to our discussion on childlike faith. Yeah, there was a lot about those kinds of services and the things that went on that had a real childish-ish feel to them. Yeah. And that was one of them, when everyone would start spewing off in tongues at once, and you would hear the volume getting higher and higher and higher as people tried to be heard over each other. Right. People were doing it to be heard, which is another thing that the Bible warns against. But in too many churches, it's allowed. Yeah. And it perpetuates the childish aspect of this faith. The next thing on the list in this article was the need to be the center of attention. I know of a lot of evangelicals that fall into this category. Oh, yeah. People who write letters that they want read to the entire congregation or youth group. They kind of fall into that category. Yeah. This manifests a lot when people rage quit church, just like we were talking about,
Oh, yeah.
because the pastor didn't pay them enough attention or they felt that people in the church didn't like them. This happened several times in youth groups, several times when I was a youth group member, but only one time where we got the long letter and you need to read
Yeah.
this to everybody. But we had a few rage quits.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to be honest, when I was about 15, I almost rage quit youth group myself over a couple of things that I got talked down over. You know, my youth pastor brought me in and kind of talked me down off the ledge, and I was able to get back to quote unquote work, because for me, I was already embarking on my ministry with this, but there were certain things that happened that really put me in fuck this mode about it too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been guilty of that one too, the whole rage quitting youth group or church or whatever. It also manifested, remember when we were talking about Mission Impossible, with that girl standing there in front of everybody and saying, the biggest problem that we have with you is we don't feel like you love us. I'm sorry, but it goes both ways. I didn't feel loved by the lynch mob either.
No.
I didn't feel loved by the attitude that that church took toward us and how little respect we got from them. I didn't feel very loved by them either. But I wasn't basing that on whether or not I was going to continue helping those people or whether I was going to continue ministering to those kids. I wasn't there to build up my ego. I wasn't there to be loved. I was there to do what I believed God had put me there to do.
Right.
So to be told after working 3 jobs on the outside and still managing to spend 20 hours a week at that church, and after not being called twice during snowstorms to let us know that we didn't have to come out because they weren't having church, with all the crazy stuff that I talked about in episode 11, and I know that one by heart, I still managed to take myself out of it for the most part until they organized the lynch mob. And I realized that there was really no good that I could do here, that it was really time to shake their dust from my sandals and walk off.
Yeah.
But prior to that, I wasn't worrying about whether or not anybody loved me. I was worrying about whether or not I was doing what I was supposed to do there. And good things were happening there.
Yeah.
But that whole situation falls in lockstep with what we're talking about tonight, too. A bunch of whiny children not getting their way. A bunch of whiny children who didn't like the idea that these bad kids were coming into their midst with their cigarettes and their lascivious words to the girls and the other things that just made them normal teenagers. Oh, we can't have that here in our little cloister.
Right.
So, again, very childish way of looking at things. And that one individual who basically looked at me and basically told me I could go to hell. It's like, so let me make sure that I understand what you're saying. God isn't willing that anyone should perish, but as far as you're concerned, I can go to hell.
Right.
And it was just a moment, a knee-jerk reaction to something else that I said, but it goes back to the way children respond to things and how they lash out. And there were a lot of children, a lot of emotional children in that room that day too.
Yeah.
And I mean, the level of maturity that came out in the adults, forget about the teenagers, the adults in that room was staggering. And it had everything to do with how they'd been taught to look at themselves. And in this church in particular, the parenting aspect of what the pastor was laid on them pretty heavily. And even though the parent figure in this situation really didn't have the first clue how to use his authority, people still looked to him as the authority because he was the one who slew the dragon.
Yeah.
Got rid of the last pastor who certain people had problems with. So he had the my hero thing going for him too. And again, very childish way of dealing with anything. And the way that that situation was dealt with on Bring a Friend Day, I can't believe that just came up twice in one episode.
Yeah.
But the way that it was handled and the timing and structure of it was incredibly immature.
Oh yeah.
And I sat there literally that day thinking to myself, I feel like I'm the only grown up in the room, because what did the pastor do? He had said things to me behind closed doors when it was just the two of us in the room. And then when all these people were around him with their own opinions, completely backpedaled and sat there and asked me, Do you even care about the spiritual well-being of our kids? It's like, yeah, we talked about this, and your attitude toward it was a little different 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
But as soon as he was cornered by all of these angry people, all of a sudden he goes into child mode.
Yeah.
And he's the scared child in this room full of wolves.
Yeah.
So he taught them well. The attitudes that we saw that day were manifestations of what he taught and manifestations of how he dealt with things.
Yep.
He dealt with other things in very childish ways too. And I talked about certain things that I saw, like when we would go out for lunches and whatnot. He had very quasi-racist things to say about certain people who worked in the restaurants, the way that they managed their businesses. And there were all kinds of comments that I really didn't feel should be coming from someone who is in a position where he is supposed to, quote unquote, be all things to all people.
Yeah.
So, but I'm going to leave that there because, we're not doing Mission Impossible Part 2, but all of this really just started bubbling up in my head as we were talking about the rest of it.
Yeah.
And I did make the note of "we don't feel like you love us" because that, and it's not the most hurtful thing that anyone ever said to me, but in that context and at that time, I think it was.
Yeah.
And just the sheer ridiculousness of it based on what I had been doing in that place. It's like, that's a real childish way of looking at this. Where's the love for the youth director? What have you done to show that you love me? Or does that matter? No, it doesn't, because this is a very selfish and self-centered and egotistical religion.
Right.
And it has to do with me, 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 me. You don't love me. I'm not required to love you. Well, you kind of are. But, from the standpoint of a child, I want my needs met. I need my needs met. I need to know that you love me. And I don't really need to do much to show that I love you. A kid at Christmas, they're not showering their parents with presents, but they feel slighted if there isn't a tree full of stuff for them. And that's the same type of thing. We don't feel like you love us. Why? Because you only got 35 presents this year instead of 36?
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. And it has everything to do with the way that these churches teach people to think from birth to 36 months and beyond. And that statement by that girl was a manifestation of a lot of really toxic evangelical thinking.
Yeah.
But people in general have a lot of those same attitudes. It's just that once you reach a certain age, you start understanding that not everybody's going to like you or love you.
Yeah.
And you become better at recognizing what love is, and you become better at receiving it, or at least most people do.
Yeah.
There are some people out there who are incapable of receiving love. It's very sad, but they're out there. And that is also a matter of emotional maturity. All of these things taken into account, again, I don't fault the person who said this. I fault the system that taught her that it was okay to think that way.
Yeah.
So the stuff, as hot under the collar as it still makes me, these people have long since been forgiven as far as I'm concerned, because they're products. They didn't have the autonomy to be able to make better decisions, because that was robbed of them the moment that someone started telling them about Jesus. But let's move on. Bullying is the next one. Bullying manifests in direct insults toward people as described above, but often involves a number of interactions over a period of time. The whole thing of rebuking and insulting and Bible bombing the same person over the same issue over and over and over again, which I had seen happen and I had been complained to about as a youth member, not even a youth pastor or youth director. As a youth member, I heard about these types of things happening and people taking issue with other people's behaviors or opinions or things that they did, and just putting everything that they did and said under a microscope and complaining about it.
Yeah.
Not even to a youth pastor, but to other members of the youth group, myself included. And I got a lot of that because even early on, people looked at me from the perspective of the leader and expected me to not only know what to do about it, but take action. And I was always big on the Pauline principle here and said, well, have you talked to this person? Oh, well, you're a lot of help. Well, I am helping you because I'm helping you achieve a little bit of spiritual maturity here. This is what the Bible says you need to do. You haven't done it. You need to go do it. And then if they don't want to listen to you and you want to take me with you to talk to them too, then I'm more than happy to do that. But that was rarely good enough.
Oh,
they
no.
bottom line is they wanted to stew in it. They wanted to stew in it, and they wanted to continue raining down chaos. And that's where a lot of that comes from. There's power in being right. And when I say being right, I mean being right in your own head. And that's where a lot of this kind of spiritual bullying comes from. You think that you're right, and you think that everyone else around you should be conducting themselves the way that you do. They should be doing things the way you do. They should be listening to the music that you do. They should be dressing the way that you do. They should be spending as much time in church as you do. And you know what? I'll admit that there were times when I thought those kinds of things, but I was able to talk myself down from them pretty effectively and recognize that not everybody is going to have the same commitment to this that I did.
Right.
So the more I reminded myself of that, the less these thoughts had a foothold. And I don't think that I personally ever did this to anybody. But I heard about it, and I had people complain to me about it, and I even had the bullies coming to me and saying, you need to do something about this, that, and the other, or this person, or that situation. It happened a lot. But it's another sign of a childish adult, where you never get out of this mode of playing the bully.
Right.
And once you get, quote-unquote, saved, it may manifest in different ways and down other avenues, but it's still bullying. Budding narcissism. Oh, here we go. Here we go. We're going to talk about the personality disorders now. Budding narcissism. Now, in this context, we're talking about specific aspects of this one personality disorder. But as we continue, you're going to see that there are bits and pieces of a lot of personality disorders that are brought to the surface through evangelical thinking. We talked about a lot of it during our discussion on mental health, so consider this kind of a second part to that discussion. The exclusivity nature of evangelical faith is a breeding ground for personal and group narcissism. Evangelicals hold the key to eternal life, or so they think. They have the cookie. This makes them feel more important and more superior to other people, particularly the unsaved and the unchurched. It manifests in both inward and outward judgmental thought patterns and behaviors. From the article, this narcissistic tendency may initially look like strength, but in reality, it reflects a serious weakness, being unable to see beyond the self. How ironic that a religion that preaches aspiring to the death of the self-life actually goes way further than it intends toward creating people who are so self-centered that they turn narcissistic in their thinking. Again, from the article, psychologically strong people listen to others, hoping to understand others' feelings, concerns, and preferences. Narcissists hear only themselves and are emotionally brittle as a result. Oh, have I seen this recently? Evangelical religion as a philosophy breeds this kind of thinking, and it manifests it in really, really nasty ways. But it starts with this notion that Jesus is the only way. There's no reason to consider any other thoughts, theories, or points of view when it comes to your salvation. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. No one comes unto the Father but by me. There are myriad verses that reinforce this concept. And as people continue thinking along these lines, as these thoughts get more embedded, the more it starts to alter their personality or bring out the worst in the personality disorder that they already have. Sometimes this type of thing appeals to the narcissist because this is something that they can turn around and stand their ground on and say, I'm right about this, period, end of story. And I can remember being, I think it was on one of my VN weekends, where one of the speakers held up a Bible and said, this book, this right here, is not a sword. It's an invitation. And I remember going up to them after their talk and saying, well, my Bible says that the Word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. So while I can agree with you, I also think that you're not looking at this from the right perspective. And it's a very narcissistic way of looking at it, I think. When you view this book that's supposed to be a manual on how to live your life in a way that you can use to attack other people with,
Right.
and assert your rightness with, that starts manifesting narcissistic thoughts and behaviors. I don't think that I have that particular disorder. I know what's going on with me. Anxiety, PTSD, depression, I know that these are the things that I deal with. As far as cluster B disorders, I don't think so. 7 years in therapy, it's never been brought up. But let me tell you, these thoughts were definitely in my head. They are no longer, which tells me that this is not a problem for me, but it also shows how this faith can breed these things. Again, I think that most of it is there when you're born. And I think that being planted in the right soil, they manifest. But they can also be inserted. They can also be placed in there. And if you get too far into it, if you really do reach a point where you have died to yourself, to the point where this religion is who you are, then I think that it absolutely can be installed in your head and not leave. You see, my problem was that I never allowed it to get that much of a foothold. I never allowed it to become so much a part of me that I lost myself. And I'm so thankful for that. But I do know that I thought like this. And I do know that if I had really, really surrendered to it, then this probably would be me. And I'm very, very thankful that I never lost the ability to think rationally, that I always questioned, that it was always in my head that, sure, you may think that you're right, but what if someone were to prove to you that you were wrong? And I was always willing to see that happen. Even though this religion gave me the level of acceptance and the level of confidence that it did, I never stopped listening to what other people had to say. And that is something that a narcissist is not capable of. So in my case, I feel like I dodged a bullet because that could have been me, but it never became me because my brain would never allow it to become me, because me was always in there waiting and clawing to get out.
Yeah.
The next thing on the list in this article, immature defenses. Children tend to regard the best defense as a strong offense. While that defensive strategy may work in football, attacking anyone who expresses a viewpoint different from what they want is, in life, a primitive defense mechanism. That's a quote from the article. Here are my thoughts. Evangelicals are great at this. Oh, and developing that strong offense often manifests in being offended by everything, just like we were talking about before.
Oh, yeah.
From an opinion that they don't like that comes from the pulpit to feeling scorned because the pastor won't drop everything and talk to them after a service. Because, I'm sorry, your average pastor is busy at the end of a service. He's got an entire congregation that he needs to deal with. But I've seen people get offended and rage quit church because the pastor wouldn't spend 10, 15 minutes just talking to them when everyone else is coming up and wanting to shake his hand and say hello or say goodbye because they're going home or whatever. And I've seen people get so offended by this that they've rage quit church because they've decided their pastor doesn't care about them. Well, yeah, your pastor cares about you, but he cares about everybody else in the room too. So take a number. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there are some people that just aren't good at that. And many evangelicals fall into this trap. It's like, okay, well, he doesn't like me, so fuck it. I'm just going to go someplace else. And they go searching for greener pasture and they never find it.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't exist. Because all pastors are going to treat their sheep with equal respect, with equal care. And until you start playing the lost sheep act with the hopes of him coming after you, you're just going to be one of the herd. And and most out there are perfectly happy to be one of the herd. And then there are the ones that insist on being the lost sheep. And when they play the lost sheep card and the pastor doesn't pick it up, boom, they're gone.
Yeah.
So I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen more than once. For everyone else, a 5-second handshake and a smile is enough, but not being able to capture the pastor's full attention for some results in that affronted and undervalued feeling that they may rage quit over the first time, or they may let it stew for months or even years. and become more and more bitter and become more and more toxic in that environment because now these ill feelings are manifesting. I remember somebody telling me about how he had a problem with the pastor of his previous church because he went up to the pastor at the end of service and shook the pastor's hand, told him how much he appreciated the sermon, and then someone else came right up to him and the pastor turned his back on him. Well, this other person came up from behind and tapped him on the shoulder. So what did he do? He turned around to talk to this person. And now, of course, his brain is focused on this person. He's not thinking about the fact that he's got his back turned to this other person.
Right.
And it happens. I've done this. I've had people whisper in my ear. I was at a men's breakfast at one point, and one of our regulars at Faith Assembly, a guy that I actually really liked a lot, was there, and he had brought one of his friends. And I had gotten into a little bit of a conversation with this guy. And I don't even remember what was... I think I was just talking to somebody else. And all of a sudden, I feel this little tap on my shoulder and a whisper in my ear, "You've got your back to Gene." I'm like, oh, man. And I'm thinking, was he offended? And he kind of was. But, there were a lot of us there. Yeah. And I wasn't talking to him at that moment. And someone over here decided they were going to talk to me. So I kind of tilted a shoulder and had my back to my boy Gene. Sorry. It happened. And if Gene wants to have another chat, then you know what? My back would be to this person now too. But some people get real offended by that.
Oh, yeah.
Some people just, you turn your back on them and it's a big deal. This was not a big deal. What I did was not a big deal. And what this pastor did was not a big deal. But some people cannot help being affronted and offended by everything.
Right.
And it's a very childish way of dealing with interpersonal problems. And my first question there was, well, did you ever talk to the guy? He's like, I didn't feel like I could because he was the pastor of the church. It's like, well, if you can't talk to your pastor, then you're probably better off not being there. Mm. But hopefully you don't feel that way about and I named the pastor of our church because I find him to be very approachable. And he may not agree with you, but he'll always listen to you.
Yeah.
So if the issue is that you don't trust that pastor to deal with the situation on an appropriate or mature level, that's one thing. But not even trying, not even giving him the chance, that's very childish. I'm sorry, it just is. Mm-hmm. Another primitive defense, again from the article, is denial. And believe me, I've been through this one. I've been through this one too. And recently, I didn't say that. I never said that. And when in fact, they absolutely did. And I've been able, I've had somebody say this to me and angrily insist that they never said what I called them out on. And it's just scroll up in the conversation because, never put it in writing if you don't want it to be repeated. Okay?
Yeah.
Never put it in a sound clip either. But in writing, it's much easier to find. So you scroll up, screenshot, send. You were saying... And even then, sometimes they'll try and weasel out of it. Well, you took it out of context. That's not what I meant, and you know it. But here's the context right here. Here's the entire conversation. This is precisely how you meant it. But people in that instant will not back down.
Right.
It's a very childish way of dealing with it. They'll fly into tantrums. They'll start yelling. They'll start getting even more offended. And it will become more and more your fault the more you try and argue logic with them.
Yeah.
Evangelicals say a lot of things when they're angry. And when they get called on it, they either insist that they never said it or that they were somehow misunderstood. This is, it's a people thing, not an evangelicals thing.
Yeah.
But in this context, it manifests a lot in interpersonal relationships with people in church and their pastors and whatnot. The next thing is no observing ego. That is no ability to see, acknowledge, or learn from their mistakes.
Right.
This is cluster B to the hilt. And it's also, in evangelical terms, the result of being told you can negate all of the bad decisions that you've made and negative behaviors you've engaged in by simply saying a prayer and asking to be forgiven. Since evangelicals are taught that they can perpetually wipe the slate clean by repenting over and over and over again, they often simply dismiss their mistakes, place them at the foot of the cross, and never actually deal with them or even try to change. Mm-hmm. God loves me as I am. He's forgiven me every time I've asked and will forgive me every time I asked. And then they pull out 1 John 1:9 as the basis for that. There are a few associated mental illnesses, that go along with this as well. Dependent personality disorder. That manifests in different ways. A lot of times we're talking about codependence. And codependent people, when they don't find what they're looking for in their pastor, that's when they rage quit church. Adult child syndrome is another personality disorder that you see a lot of times in people in church, and it manifests in most of the ways that we've been talking about tonight. And in people outside church, it makes it very difficult to have relationships with anybody, whether they are platonic, romantic, family, whatever. It makes it very, very difficult to have a relationship with these people, because who wants to sit around at Thanksgiving dinner with a 40-year-old toddler?
Yeah.
Immature personality disorder, which also shares a lot of its traits with BPD, to the point where I wonder if that's just what they call it in Australia, because that's where this came from. A website called theaustralian.com, and an article called Forever Young, Immature Personality Disorder. And as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking this sounds an awful lot like borderline personality disorder. All of the same things are there. And since we're talking about borderline, a lot of the symptoms of that manifest in symptoms, things that you can see people do as a result of this childlike faith that they've been taught to cultivate inside their heads. Age regression is another big one, also part of BPD, and it just escalates. Now, again, a lot of these things are inherent with people when they are born, and they manifest as they get older. And just like we talked about a few weeks ago when we were talking about the subject of mental illness, a lot of these things find homes in churches because they're so normalized already. When that person shows up on the scene, they're just comfortable being themselves. And then the very worst of their personalities start coming out, because now they feel comfortable letting other people see it because they're seeing it in other people in the church. Now, I'm not saying that everybody at church acts like this. I mean, there are plenty of well-adjusted adults forgiving the fact that they believe that a girl ate an apple given to her by a talking snake. We'll kind of skirt past that and just go on record saying there are people out there that, for the most part, have a good head on their shoulders. They just need this to cling to. For whatever reason, they need it in their life.
Yeah.
And they're well-adjusted adults. They don't have these problems. So your average evangelical church doesn't look like a daycare. There's a level of maturity that does exist there where you know that you're among adults. And there's the small number of people that go into the extreme ends of this.
Right.
And become things that would be worse than if they were left to their own devices. If they didn't have these influences in their life, then some of these personality traits may never manifest, and possibly not manifest to anywhere near the degree, and not get the validation that they get by these people being in this setting. So, yeah, if you have borderline personality disorder, if you have narcissistic disorders or anything in the cluster B family, then being in this kind of an environment is going to cultivate them.
Right.
But like we were talking about a few weeks ago, with the help of a licensed clinician who understands what these things are and can steer you into proper avenues of dealing with them, you're going to be far better off than hiding in church and being recommended counseling from within the church walls. So the manifestation of it can be mild, it can be moderate, or it can be severe. When you place somebody in an environment that teaches them to take all of their defects of character and shove it onto a fake deity,
Right.
then they're just going to get worse over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy. Unless they get out, unless they figure out a way to think for themselves long enough to understand that where they are, at least where they're at in their head, is not healthy. Forget about where they're going to church, but figure out that what's going on in their head isn't healthy, and that there's a reason why they're failing in all their relationships, and why people don't seem to like them, and why no one outside the walls of that church seems to want to have anything to do with them. Once they start dealing with that stuff, they can start getting better. They can start cataloging the those behaviors and the thoughts that go along with them and do something constructive with them. But in this environment, it's nigh unto impossible, and they're not going to be encouraged to get the help that they need either.
No.
So just a few thoughts in closing here that I wanted to get out. And I do this all the time when I'm researching this stuff. I always have these thoughts that go through my head about the subject itself. So hopefully it strikes a chord with somebody out there, what I'm going to talk about. Before I do you have anything you want to add?
I can't disagree with anything that you have said.
No. And yeah, because you've seen it. You've seen it
Yeah,
firsthand.
I've seen it all. It's really crazy. And when you've been around Christians enough, or, well, evangelicals, you see so much of this ridiculous, childish posturing that they don't realize is childish. They don't realize how childish they sound or look because they're right. They're taught they're right, and they're taught that how they think is right, how they feel is right, and how they act is right.
And that's why I'm going to give you my mantra one more time. Don't blame the individual. Don't blame the person for this, because the environment is bringing out the worst of these things that are either already there or that have been planted there by the kind of thinking that this religion encourages. So it's not them. A lot of times, if somebody has a mental illness and it manifests in one of these ways, church is the only place they're going to feel safe because it's normalized there.
Right.
So you can't blame the person for trying to find a little bit of sanctuary, pardon the pun. You can't blame them for wanting to find a place where they belong. But it would be so much better if there was someone in their life telling them that you don't need to do this. You don't need to cloister yourself in this environment. There are ways that you can start steering your thoughts in different directions and get certain things under wraps and get people to like you and love you a little bit more. But they're not going to find that within the walls of an evangelical church that slights anything along the lines that would actually help them.
Right.
And offers them counterfeits like Christian counseling. They're never going to get any better. So, again, that's why I don't blame the individual. The system is rigged against them. The system is rigged against anyone with any level of insecurity or illness or anything along those lines. It is rigged against them. And of course, they're going to cling to something that makes them feel more them.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. So, few parting thoughts. When I think of the word childlike, here's what I see. I see everything that this religion is not. I see the excitement in the newness of everything. I think of curiosities that eventually get satisfied. I think of important life lessons being learned. I think of new discoveries that seem to happen every single day. When you're a kid, there's something new to discover every single day. I think of figuring out who I want to be, who I want to be friends with, spending long hours thinking of what it'll be like to grow up. Now, those are the kid level things. As an adult, I see it as maintaining that spirit of curiosity. I see it as always being in learn mode. I see it as loving unconditionally and understanding that we need each other. I see it as being in a perpetual state of discovery, both in things about ourselves and in the world around us. I see it as being dealt hard lessons and actually learning and growing as a result. I see it as learning more and more every day about who we are and what we want to be as grown-ups. I see it in not being afraid to be a little silly at times and enjoying the simple things in life. Finally, I see it as the part of ourselves that we all too often see through a glass darkly, but that we should really strive to see more clearly over time. Remembering how we thought, spoke, and reasoned like children makes us appreciate the things we've learned and the ways that we've grown since. Don't let your religion rob you of that last bit. It matters. Even Paul endorsed it. You matter. Your thoughts matter. Your opinions matter. And your sense of self matters. You know what doesn't matter? The opinion of a deity who lies to you and tells you that you'll only ever be happy if you stay a child and let daddy take care of you. It's time to take a bite out of that apple. Savor the sweetness of the self-awareness and mature thought that comes with it. Open your eyes to the world in which we live. Enjoy the one and only life you will ever live with all of its ups and downs. Stop believing that you can't grow up and be happy at the same time. You can and you should. It's just one more, pardon the term, baby step that you can take toward getting and staying unbound. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.